In our previous lessons, we've been learning HTML, which is Hypertext Markup Language. Today, and the remainder of this week, we're going to be talking about something called CSS. And CSS is a new language used to describe how the HTML elements should be styled. So if you think back to the web pages we've seen so far, we have not seen any color. It's strictly been a white background with the black font color. So today we're going to introduce something called cascading style sheets. That's where the CSS comes in. And within a cascading style sheet, there's something called a CSS selector. And basically, when you select something, you pick what you're going to operate on. So in this case, it's which HTML tag are we styling? Are we putting color on a heading? Are we changing the size of a paragraph font? So those are some things that you do when you pick a CSS selector. So you decide which HTML tags you're going to style. And then once you have a CSS selector, each CSS selector has something called a rule set, which basically says, in my example, for a heading, what color do we want it? Do we want it to be bold, italics? So anything that you want to do to style it so that when the browser interprets the HTML, the CSS also provides information to the browser about how it should look. So you need to go into code.org. So again, by now we should be pretty comfortable doing this. So we're going to go into our code.org. It will open on its own tab. You need to sign in. Again, I'm going to sign in with my account and you will sign in with yours. And again, it should be your first name dot last name at bb-sd.com, and you know what your password is. And go ahead and click sign in. Okay, so we have jumped to lesson 6. Because we're only in 9 weeks, I'm picking and choosing which lessons we're going to do for right now. So you're going to want to drop lesson 6 if you don't see it. And we're going to go straight into the lesson overview because the question of the day is there as well. So click on level 1. So the question of the day to start lesson 6, first of all, it's called styling text with CSS. So basically the text that we have on our web pages, we're going to be telling the browser how we want that to look in addition to how we want it to be laid out on the web page. So the question is, how can we change the style of text on a web page? This lesson introduces CSS as a way to style elements on the page. The class learns the basic syntax, which syntax means how the rules need to be entered for the CSS rule sets, and then explores properties that impact HTML text elements. Finally, we'll discuss the differences between content, which are your words, structure, how you want them laid out, and now style with CSS when making a personal web page. So 2 new vocabulary words we've already talked about today is CSS, or cascading style sheets. It is a new language different from HTML, but it is used to describe how HTML elements should be styled. And within CSS, there are things called CSS selectors. And they are part of the CSS rule set, and it defines which HTML elements, such as the H1 tag or a paragraph tag, that the style should be applied to. And as I said, code.org does a good job of showing us a couple of examples of what we're going to be working with. So these are rule sets, which is what we talked about right here, that will be in possibly a CSS selector. So we're going to see too that there's some different characters used. We're going to use a colon and a semicolon in CSS selector rule sets. Okay, go ahead and click continue to get to level 2. Okay, this is just going to be a sample website, which is just really one web page. So it tells us to click on the website below to discover some new types of styling for your page. So go ahead and take your mouse, and you know you have a hyperlink, so you can click with your left mouse button. And here we have some text. It talks about Andrew's reading list of great speeches. one thing you might notice, first of all, there's color. Very nice. There's italics, because you can see the characters are slanting to the right. There is an underline under something. There's a much smaller font. This is likely a heading 6, and so forth. So if we go down, we can see that there's some different things that we haven't seen before. So this is introducing you to the concept of CSS, because HTML provided the words to the browser for this web page, but CSS told the browser whether to make it red or purple, whether to underline it, whether to make it italics or not. So this is what we're going to talk about today, how to style the contents of your web page. Okay, so this time you want to hit the back button to get back to code.org. And we're ready to go to level 3, so go ahead and click continue. Okay, it says we're going to add style. If you notice, there's some colored text on the right, which we haven't seen before. So, as always, there's some instructions for us. It says this web lab project is using a new language to add style to the page. With a partner, which will partner together, explore both the index.html, which is in the file section of the web tool, and the style.css files. It says be ready to discuss the following questions. So before we actually read the questions, I'm going to ask you to turn on your inspector tool, which we've used before. So in the purple line here, click inspector off to toggle it on, and then just point to the first sentence. It says, we're about to learn a new language. And if you notice over in your workspace, it is an H1 tag. That's why it's quite large. And the other thing to notice, we don't see anything about blue anywhere, yet the text is blue. So we're going to find out that's the CSS, the new language cascading style sheet, working for us. Okay, point to the next one. It says, and it's going to help us add style. You might have to scroll down, style. So that's an H2, so it's not as large as the first sentence. And then the next one you want to point to says, but how does it work? And now we're back to an H1, and it is bigger than the previous line, and it's also blue. So we're going to find out how it works. But before we do, let's go up here to the documentation and drop the arrow. It says, how do I switch between files? Because I just pointed out we have 2 files now. We've always just had index.html. Now we have style.css. It says click the name of the file you want to look at in the menu on the left side of the screen. So in a minute, that's how we're going to switch. We're going to just switch between by clicking, and then whatever page we have selected, that's what loads in the workspace. And typically code.org always loads the index.html first. But the questions that we're going to look at, it says, what changes is this new language making to the page? So I think we already concluded that the CSS language is providing this color over on the right. You can turn your inspector off, by the way. So turn your inspector off. It says, how is this language different from HTML? We're going to see here in 1 minute. And it says, how are the index.html and the style.css files connected? Okay, I want you to look in the workspace. If you notice, there's a link tag, something called a link tag. You know it's a tag because it starts with a less than, ends with a greater than. Now, one thing that's different about this tag is it's not between the opening body and the closing body, which is, I said, where we will put all of our web content. But the reason this is not between the opening and the closing body tag is because it's not web content. This is the tag that is needed to actually connect this index.html with this style.css. So we have to tell the browser to go look at this file when it loads index.html, so it knows how to style the words that are contained between the opening body and the closing body. So this is something called a link tag, and it links index.html to style.css. And it tells the browser we're linking a style sheet. And style sheet is one word, if you notice, so you can't change that. It has to always be one word. And this is the first time we have a tag that has something called attributes. which means it's not enough to just tell the browser the word link as a tag. You have to tell it other information like how does it relate? It relates because it's a style sheet. And this href stands for hypertext reference, meaning it's going to get the file from somewhere else. And the file is style.css. Okay, let's go ahead and click on style.css in the file section. So as soon as you do that, do you notice that it loads something different in the workspace? Okay, and if you notice, I'm clicked beside the H1. Do you see how it's highlighting the code, the content on the right? And that's because if you remember in the index.html, the first line was an H1 tag, the second line was an H2, that's why it doesn't have a border around it right now, and the third one was an H1. So this CSS selector selects the HTML element H1 and says to the browser, okay, the color is going to be blue and the text alignment is going to be centered. So I didn't point that out, but now we see that it's actually centered. Everything we've done before has been always to the left, left aligned. So that's another attribute that you can use to style your text. And then if you click down where the H2 is, just click in front of the H for H2. And you notice that highlights, and it's going to help us add style because that was an H2 tag in our index.html. So the other thing that we'll see here shortly in a video is in CSS, cascading style sheets, you have selectors which select the tags. So these selectors have to match what's in your index.html. If you put one in your CSS, an HTML tag that you don't use in your index.html, it won't hurt anything, but it won't style anything either. So in this case, we used both the H1 and the H2. You don't have to style both of them, but if you're going to add color to one in style, you're typically going to add it for all. So we have two CSS selectors, and each CSS selector is started with a curly brace, and then within that, you have your rule sets. So we want to change the color. We want to change text align. And notice between each of the rules and the property, you have to have something called a colon. And in the next level, we're going to see a video which highlights this. So I won't spend a lot of time right now, but just notice you have a colon, and we have the value, which we want the color to be blue. And then we have something called a semicolon. And if you know about semi, it means half. So we have a colon has two dots, a semicolon only has one. Okay, and actually the semicolon key, when you hold that key and hold the shift, that's when you get the colon. So if you want to look at your keyboard for a minute, the semicolon key is 2 to the left of the enter key. And if you just just hit the key, you get a semicolon. If you hold the shift, you get a colon. Okay. And again, has to start and end with the brace. Okay, and then H2, same thing. It's new, so you have to start and end, not with the less than or the greater than, because that's what we do in HTML. And CSS, it's the brace. And then you're going to have whatever rules you want. And you can have one, you can have two, you can have 20 rules in there. Whatever you do is you put whatever you want the rule to be, like how it's going to be aligned. So if you notice, H2 is not centered, but it's aligned all the way over to the right. So up here we had text align center for the H1 tag, and they were centered. Those two lines were centered. Now we have text align right. Now it's aligning all the way over at the right. And instead of the color being blue, the color is red. So the other thing to point out about CSS rule sets is it doesn't matter what order you put the rule sets in. You can put them in whatever order you want. Okay, so I think we answered the first question. What changes is this new language making to the page? It's changing the color and the text alignment for the H1 tag and the H2 tag. It says, how is this language different from HTML? We're not using the less than and the greater than, but we are adding braces, colons, and semicolons, and they're very important. You have to have them. If you leave out the bottom one, you won't get the result that you want. We'll create a bug. We've talked about bugs before. And it says, how are the index.html and the style.css files connected. I'm going to click back on the index.html, which you can do, and that link tag is what links index.html to style.css. Okay, and we'll talk more about it, but again, style sheet always has to be one word. It has to have quotations around it, and you put an equal between the value and what it's going to relate to. So again, href, you have to have href, you can't have hrfe, it won't understand. And again, there's an equal, and then whatever the value is has to come between the opening and closing quotes. Okay, go ahead and click finish to get to level 4. Okay, I want you to watch this video. So here are the questions you want to consider as you're watching. How is the style of a web page different from the structure? And why might you want your web page to have a certain style? So this person's name is Danny. She's from code.org and she's going to explain. So I'm going to stop or pause on my video. You want to pause my video and you want to play the code.org video. And when you're ready, you can restart my video. It just occurred to me that I forgot to tell you to split your screen, but I'm thinking by now you have done that. But remember, you restore down, drag to the right for your code.org, and have the video on the left. All right, go ahead and click continue because we're going to get to level 5. Again, in level 5, I see this message that we talked about before. It said this icon means that this level is part of a larger project. Changes will be saved across these levels. So in other words, you're going to see this web page again. So all you have to do is just click the X if you see it. If you don't worry about it. Sometimes it pops up, sometimes it doesn't. Okay, we're going to talk about CSS and text color. We just saw the color red and blue on the previous web page. It says this HTML file uses a style sheet, style.css, and it's down here in the file section, to give the page a particular style. The style sheet contains information about each of the HTML elements and how they should look. So if you look down under the do this, it says find the code in the style sheet. Click on style CSS in the file list that is making the H1 heading red. So go ahead and click on style.css. And if you notice, we have a heading, which is, I'm sure, in H1, and its color is going to be red. So if we go back to the index.html and we turn on our inspector, so go ahead and turn on your inspector after you click index.html, and notice that now we do not have CSS in our workspace, but rather we have HTML because we switched files. Go ahead and turn your inspector on and point to the first title, which is Odd World Records. If you notice, it is in H1. And if you notice up in the head tag, there's a link tag which links this HTML program to a style sheet called style.css. Okay, point to the next thing on the web page, which is an H3 heading. So right now it doesn't have any style. And here's why. Go ahead back to your style.css. You can turn off your inspector. And if you notice, there is not a selector to select H3. So there will be no style for H3 presently. Okay, so that's why you're not seeing anything of color for H3. But we can find that the color for H1 is red. So if you scroll back up, part of what this instructions are asking us to do is it says change the code for the color of the H1 heading from red to a different color. So before we do that, I want to show you they have some useful documentation. It says what colors can I use in CSS? So go ahead and drop that arrow. And it says CSS includes most common colors, red, blue, green, etc., and many uncommon ones. You can see a full list of CSS colors at W3 Schools HTML color names. So go ahead and click that so that you can open that up. So if you notice, it opens up a new tab. And it gives you a whole list of colors that you can pick from. And you just need to decide what color name. Now, we can use the hexadecimal value, it's called, but for today, we're just going to use the actual color name that it gives it. If you click on any color, you're then going to see a whole list of other colors that you can do. The background of that color will be that color, but then you can still see all the other colors. So I'm going to pick, my favorite color is magenta, so I'm sure there's a magenta. So let's go back to our code.org, or you can find a color you like. So if you have to pause my video for a minute while you look, go ahead and do that. When you're ready, go back to code.org, and you're going to come over into your workspace. Yes, you're going to select red with your left mouse button. Be careful, you do not want to get rid of the semicolon or the colon. So I'm going to type magenta. As soon as I start typing, it likely will pop up the color, and you can just select it. If it doesn't, you can continue typing. And as soon as I do that, it's an instant change. Mine is now magenta, and yours would be whatever color you chose. Okay. And again, the next thing in the documentation says, how does the code work? It says, here is the code that is making the H1 tag heading red. It says H1 is the selector. It selects which HTML element. It says it specifies which elements will have to follow the rules inside the curly braces. So these are called curly braces. The color is going to be red. It says this is the rule that makes the text inside the H1 tags red. Color is the property. It explains what the rule is about in the case of the text color. Red is the value. So it's a property value rule set. It explains how the rule should be applied, and in this case, making the text red. Okay, and the final documentation, which again, you might have to slide down your vertical scroll bar in both cases, it says the punctuation such as the curly braces, the colon, which has 2 dots, and the semicolon, 1 dot, 1 comma, help the computer to understand the rules in the style sheet. The curly braces hold all the rules of a particular selector. Each rule should end in a semicolon. So that's over here. And again, that's very important. And the properties and the values are always separated by a colon. So colon to separate the rule and then the property. Okay. And then the very most important thing is you have to have a curly brace to start and a curly brace to end. And the actual HTML tag, which is the CSS selector, is not inside the curly braces. It's on the outside. But the property value rule sets, so the property and its value, have to be within the opening curly brace and the closing curly brace. If you don't do that, again, browsers are programmed to make guesses, but they may not guess exactly as you like. Okay, let's go to level 6. So go ahead and click your finish. Okay, we just saw in our style.css that we have, I'm going to go ahead and click it, and you can too. We have 2 CSS selectors, H1 and P. So our instructions tell us we're going to make a new CSS rule set, which means we're going to add another HTML element to the CSS file. It says the block of code that gives rules for a particular tag is called a rule set. You can make a new rule set by copying the pattern you see in the rule set for the H1 tag. So the first thing it says is find the CSS rule set in the style sheet that determines the style for H1, for the H1 tag. We see it. Okay. Go back to index.html, so please click on that in the file section. Turn on your inspector off to on, inspector tool. Okay, and again, we know this is an H1, but I want to highlight the fact that the next heading is an H3. And again, it is smaller, but it is still larger to let us know that it is important. It's a subheading, if you will. So we know that in our style.css sheet, we have an H1 selector and a paragraph selector. Again, if we scroll down here and point to the next thing, we know that's a paragraph. So we see that highlighted. So we already have some styling for that. We haven't looked at that yet, but we have styled a paragraph. We just haven't looked at it yet. So go ahead and turn your inspector off. Go ahead back to your style.css file so it loads in the workspace. So now you should see CSS code, not HTML code. And we already found the H1 tag. So it says using the same pattern, write a new CSS rule set that will determine the style for the H3 tag. So here's what I need you to do. So watch closely, and if you have to replay the video or rewind the video a little bit, go ahead and do that. But you're going to click in front of the H1, hold your left mouse button and drag down to the closing curly brace. So everything for H1 should be selected. The selector, the curly braces, and the property value rule sets. Okay, you can right click over the selection and say copy. Okay, now you want to click right below the selection. So right after the closing curly brace and right before the P, and hit enter twice. Yeah, twice is fine, once or twice. And then you can right click and say paste. You can also do Control C to copy and Control V, like victory, V, to paste, whatever you're comfortable with. So right now we have two selectors for H1, which doesn't make any sense. So here's what I want you to do. For the one you just pasted, which should come second, go ahead and change the 1 to a 3. And immediately the H3, which we know this was H3 because we saw it in our index.html, it becomes magenta and 24 pixel size. Okay, so we're going to change the color to something different. So again, you have your color still open. You can go up and pick a different color. So I'm going to pick what goes well with magenta. I'm going to say cyan, which is C-Y-A-N. So I'm going to come back over and I can double click magenta and I'm going to start typing. You don't even have to hit backspace or delete. As soon as I hit my first letter, it goes away. And as soon as I type CY, cyan comes up, and now H3 color changed immediately. It's an immediate change because remember, this CSS file is linked to our index.html through the link tag that's in between the opening and closing head tag. And font size means how big are the characters. So likely we do not want this to be as big as the H1. So let's change the number for the font size. And by the way, PX stands for pixels. And there's 72 inches or 72 pixels to an inch vertically. So from top to the bottom of the character. So each pixel, or which is a dot of color, actually adds size vertically to a character. So let's change this to just, let's make it 20. As soon as we make it 20, you should see it's a little bit different. Then backspace it off and let's say 18. And then we really see a difference. We'll put it back to 20. So let's leave it at 20. So now by simply copying the H1 selector and changing it to H3, we can affect anywhere in index.html that we have an H3. So use your vertical scroll bar over here in the preview area, and you're going to see that you have other titles that use the H3, and they immediately are changed as well. Because again, we selected the H3 tag and said anywhere in the index.html you have an H3 tag. We want the color of the font to be cyan. We want the size to be 20 pixels. Okay, we're going to stop at level 6, but don't go anywhere yet. So we introduced the concept of cascading style sheets. You can see that it is its own language. It uses curly braces, colons, semicolons, and it has to be linked to our index.html between the opening heading tag, or head tag, excuse me, and closing head tag. And it is a link tag. It has 2 attributes, and this is the first time our tags have attributes. So what is it? We're linking to a style sheet. Which style sheet? Style.css. So we could have called this Mrs. Schweitzer.css. We would have had to have a file over here called Mrs. Schweitzer.css. So this does not just have to be called style.css. We'll see in future lessons you can have multiple style sheets because likely you're going to have multiple web pages. So you might want to have a different style sheet for each web page, or at least for more than one web page. Before you go, you're going to want to go up to your sign in where your name is, drop and sign out of code.org. Okay, and you want to go back to code.org, hit your back, or not back to code.org, I'm sorry, back to your code.org assignment, in Canvas, hit your back arrow to get back to the assignment. And you're going to want to click the Submit Assignment that's at the top. You know, it opens a text box at the bottom. You're going to type done, or as some of you have done, some of you have typed a question if you're confused about something. That's perfectly okay. I want to have the questions, and then I get back to you through the inbox. So if you're done and you don't have any questions, just type done. If you have questions, go ahead and put them in the text box. And most importantly, click Submit Assignment so that I get your submission and I know to go and check your work in code.org, or I can get back to you with an answer in the inbox to your question. Okay, you can also X out of your code.org and the two related W3 School color tabs. Okay, have a great day.